If you find that your company is running out of cash in this credit crunch, 2 INSEAD educators have come up with a 6-step strategy that works like Plavex for your balance sheet. It frees up capital. Accounting Professor S. David Young and Affiliate Professor Kevin Kaiser, thank you for being with us. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Let me start. Okay, where is this balance sheet cash and how do you get at it?
It's hidden in lots of different places. It could be in fixed assets, but what we focus on is the working capital items. So it could be trapped in your accounts receivable waiting to be sent in from the customers. It could be sitting in your inventories, and it could be in some other places as well.
Well, like what other kinds of places might you find? Or maybe you want to tell me a little bit more about how you get it out of receivables. Certainly something that's pending might make you feel good, but if it's pending for too long, you could be using that money. How do you shorten the time?
Well, one of the ways that you shorten the time it takes to collect receivables is the simple expedient of calling your customers and asking them for the money. So as you get closer to the due date, you actually contact them and say, look, I just wanted to remind you that this money is owed. And not only do you ask them for the money, but you also use it as an opportunity to communicate with them and maybe learn a little bit more about them, learn about the sorts of things that they value in your products, maybe understand a little bit more about the pricing strategies that will allow you to extract more cash from your customers. So all of this is about communication.
But are the benefits of that, do you really save enough time so that you're not annoying your customers to the point that you disrupt your good relations with them?
No, you have to be careful. You have to be viewed as someone who is trying to, in a sense, help the customer. Because customers have the same sort of pressure that we have. We're operating in a difficult economic environment, and just like we're struggling to find cash in our own business, so are they. And so what we're doing is not just hitting them up for cash, but we're also talking to them about ways that we can help them create value and unlock cash in their own business.
How do you get everybody in the company on board with this? Because most people are just concerned about profits and, as you say in your article, managing to the bottom line. I mean, that's a corporate culture shift if you want people to look at more than just what's on the bottom.
Obviously, there's a connection to the incentive system in the company. If everybody is being incentivized, if businesses are being measured performance-wise by profit, if people are being measured performance-wise on profit, then they're going to remain focused on profit. And if on top of that they're being compensated based on profit, then they're going to stay focused on profit. So clearly there's a connection here to the incentive system. We don't go into that in detail in that particular paper, but you have to step away from profit-based incentives, which do encourage this kind of behavior, because if you're managing your profit, you'll find it may be worthwhile to give your customer longer time to pay, because then you can book more revenues. You may encourage your production to generate more fixed or finished goods receivables, or inventories rather, so that you have more stuff to sell, because then your sales guys can sell more and generate more revenues. You may accept to take delivery of raw materials sooner from your suppliers, because they'll give you better pricing terms, so you'll have lower costs. So there's lots of places in which, if you're profit focused, you'll tend to mismanage your working capital. So clearly one of the areas we would suggest is be careful with profit-based incentive schemes.
That kind of change takes a lot of time. And you might lose, time or some money in between?
True, but in the short term, companies in a credit crunch are facing the risk of distress and even bankruptcy. So you don't have the time, and if you're going to change the incentive practices of these companies during healthy times, as you suggest, it's going to be very, very difficult. The convenience of distress is it forces the urgent and the important to become the same. It's important to be cash-oriented, value-oriented, present value of the future cash you're going to generate. And so with that urgency, there will be a shift in incentives.
One of the themes that we push in our article is the idea of trade-offs. So what we're urging companies to do is say, look, this might be an interesting proposition from the supplier, but what you need to do is compare what you perceive the benefits to be and actually estimate this, quantify this from acquiring larger quantities at lower price with the cost of having to carry more inventory and therefore having to finance more inventory. And so it's a question of trade-off. What we want companies to do is to make that trade-off, and make that trade-off in a way that they believe ex ante is the value-enhancing one for the firm.
And how do you bring the sales force onto this? Because they're also out there just...
A lot of it has to be incentives, the way people get paid. If you're paying people entirely on the basis of sales growth and entirely on the basis of margins, we shouldn't expect the sales force to care all that much about working capital. Why should they?
One trade-off that you mentioned, too, in terms of time was the quality of the product, or product quality.
Yes.
You felt that some of this, in some cases, was overly
Yeah, we're all in favor of quality.
Yeah.
Everybody gets measured on that, and this is one of these buzzwords that corporate managers talk about all the time. So we're all in favor of quality, but we should never forget that the primary reason why we care about quality is because it's something customers care about, and customers are willing to pay us for. So there's quality that's value added, meaning that customers are willing to give you more cash because of that attribute, whatever that attribute might be. But there can also be quality that maybe enhances the product in some objective way, in the sense that maybe it increases functionality, but it's not something the customer really cares about or values in any meaningful way. And so all you've done is you've burdened yourself with extra cost. And the customer's thinking, well, wait a minute, you're not really offering me anything that the simpler product doesn't offer, so I'm not going to pay you more money. And the problem with this, and this is one of the examples we cite in the article, is that companies try to build in so much quality into the manufacturing process that it can extend the cycle times in the factories. And while that really does enhance quality, or at least it's capable of enhancing it, the question is whether that incremental quality that you're building into the product is something the customer values. Is it something they're actually willing to give you cash money for?
So you need a reality check on your quality, actually.
And we have several examples of this, because again, it's a difficult argument to make that you can have too much quality when we all do value quality. But a couple of the examples included, I think there was the Italian food company, I think we included in the article, where they were very proud as gourmets and appreciators of food to age some of their products for a year or more. The problem is aging products for a year means it's sitting in inventory for a year.
Yeah.
And it turns out many of their customers, even if they could tell that it was a better quality product, they didn't care enough
To pay the difference.
to pay the extra cost. And in many cases, they couldn't even tell. And so even if you can tell, and we have this tendency in people who love the business that they're in, as engineers, as gourmets, as a brewer of beer, you may love your quality of your product, but if your customers aren't with you on this, then you're going to make mistakes.
You age the cheese an extra year at home, but don't try to sell it to your customers.
Yeah, go ahead and try that.
Well, and your customers will go home. You also say don't tie receivables to payables.
That goes back to the relationships that you're managing. The relationship you have with your suppliers may put you in a position of advantage or disadvantage. If it's, for example, a position of disadvantage, because for whatever reason they have a product you need for your process, and they know that and you know that, if they ask you to pay them within 10 days of delivery, you may be forced to do that. But if when you turn around to your customers and say, look, our supplier is asking us to pay them in 10 days, could you please pay us in 10 days? If you don't have that same type of relationship with your customers as you unfortunately have with your supplier, in other words, you don't have leverage or bargaining power, your products aren't sufficiently distinctive from others in the industry, with qualities and character, then they're just going to say, no, I'm paying you in 40 days because the nature of your products, the qualities, the features, the pricing, the services you're offering me are the same as 12 other guys. They're giving me 40 days to pay. There's no reason why I can pay you in 10 or should. And the fact that you have to pay your supplier in 10 has nothing to do with me.
Is there an example of this to be made in the car industry today and what happened? I don't mean to throw a curve at you, but it strikes me that that's probably something that...
There's a good example in the nature of the suppliers going bankrupt before General Motors and Chrysler did. Because in the context of the negotiating power there, the consumers have negotiating power because we can buy from BMW and Toyota and Nissan.
This is why we extend these credit terms. We allow people to pay over very extended periods of time. But if you did that on the supplier side, well, obviously some suppliers have already gone bankrupt, but they would all go bankrupt because basically they couldn't afford to wait that long to get paid.
And the nature of the bargaining power between General Motors, for example, and the customers on one side and the suppliers on the other was such that they had disproportionate negotiating power over their suppliers. So facing their own imminent bankruptcy many years ago, they decided first we're going to push the pricing pressure back onto the suppliers. The result is they're going to go bankrupt first, which they did, of course.
Not necessarily a good thing either.
No.
If you want to sell cars
but you know you're going bankrupt. If you have enough negotiating power, you push it onto your suppliers first. They die first, and then 5 years later you die, which is exactly what we saw. And consumers at the end, of course, are the ones who are pushing General Motors into bankruptcy for the simple reason they didn't appreciate the quality and the features of the cars at the prices they were being offered, and so they chose to go elsewhere.
Could that be an example of another, I'm jumping over one of your points, benchmarkers beware? I mean, and I don't mean to focus exclusively on
the point that we're making there and this applies to so many different industries, is that people sometimes get carried away with benchmarking exercise. Everybody does this, and we're not opposed to it. Indeed, we think that it's a legitimate business practice. But what we often do is we calculate a series of metrics, of indicators, company performance. For example, days of inventories, receivables, payables, et cetera. And we compare and contrast ourselves with industry averages or with key competitors or other paragons that we like to compare ourselves to. And oftentimes we'll find that on some of these dimensions we actually compare quite favorably. And so we walk away from that thinking, well, our company is just fine. On that particular dimension anyway, there's no real further improvement required or perhaps even possible because we're already near the top of the industry. So let's focus our attention somewhere else in the business. The problem with that is that the real opportunities for creativity, for innovation, the sort of things that are going to deliver substantial amounts of cash flow to your business in the future don't come from benchmarking exercises. They come from an intimate knowledge of your value chain. It comes from understanding intimately your customers, your suppliers, your technologies, the production processes in your facilities. This is where the future cash flow is going to come from. And so what happens is we in a sense, lock ourselves in this straitjacket of benchmarking where we say, well, the only thing that matters is that we compare favorably or at least do as well as our major competitors.
A great example of what we try to describe there, and one that's very well known, is the automobile industry. Again, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, comparing themselves to each other, not just in working capital, but in production efficiencies and everything else. They all agree that we're all doing okay. But the truth is, the truth is, you know, if everybody else sucks as badly as you do, you think you're okay. Well, in fact, you may suck at what you do. And over here we have Toyota, and Toyota unfortunately didn't have the luxury of being able to compare themselves directly in the early years. So instead they built a system where they compared themselves only to themselves. And they created this process called continuous improvement, where we just asked the question, how well did we do last time and could we do it better this time? In other words, it's benchmarking only against your own self in the past. And that process of continuous improvement, can we do better now than we did last time, without looking at the other guys, you know, in a sense, they blew past most of the other world's car manufacturers. I think it's fair to say all of them. In many ways, they didn't even realize it perhaps because they weren't comparing themselves to the other guys.
And then when they benchmarked,
when they finally did the benchmarking, we realized they've long since blown past everybody else. So the benchmarking is very dangerous because it may convince you you're fine when in fact somebody out there is much, much better than you are. You're just failing to compare yourselves to the right companies.
That kind of fits in with your last little comment here too, which is current and quick ratios are misleading, particularly in a recession. But that has the same feel as a benchmark. I was like, okay, this is.
Well, this comes more from the sort of bankers' perspectives on liquidity. Bankers have a tendency, as they should, to worry about what's going to happen to my position when you fail to pay me back, when you default. In that event, I want to make sure that I have a good claim on good assets from which I can realize cash fairly quickly.
I.e. receivables.
Which includes receivables and inventories, for example. So they have a tendency to look at what will the situation be if you were to fall into a liquidity crunch right now, and how much cash would I be able to recover very quickly, which leads to, I'm going to look at your current assets, what I could liquidate quickly within a few months, your current liabilities, which are what has to be paid, and I would like the current assets ideally to be more than the current liabilities. Because if I end up in a crisis, I'd like that one to cover that one. Now the problem obviously is to increase the current assets. A nice way would be give your customers longer time to pay. And that'll make your receivables nice and high. Or keep lots of finished goods inventories, raw materials inventories. That'll make your inventories very high. So your current assets look really good. And on the current liabilities, your suppliers give you 30 days to pay in 2. And then you have very small current liabilities. And the current assets to current liabilities, the current ratio, will look quite good for you. Now that's from a banker's perspective in the event of when you default. But as we realize, the tendency to manage that way is actually going to increase the likelihood that you do default, because that's not what we would call good management.
This is what we call the death scenario. That basically what the banker is doing is trying to protect himself in the event that you do default, that basically your firm does die, so that they get as much cash from you as they possibly can. And the great irony is that because you manage to the current ratio, or at least you might be suckered into managing to the current ratio, it increases the likelihood that the death scenario actually happens.
Let me end by asking you, you want this big change coming up. You want to look at balance sheets. You want to look at more than the bottom line. You want to change the sales force. How do you reward people for this, particularly at a time when everybody's getting axed? I mean, there's not a whole lot of loyalty anywhere. So how are you going to reward people? Well, what do you do?
A good reward structure is, if we work together and do this properly, you probably won't get axed. So if that's what you're worried about, then we're proposing a way of managing which makes the likelihood that you get axed much lower. It may, in some cases, reduce compensation from one year to the next, but on the other hand, if we succeed in really delivering the value systematically and creating it and delivering it systematically, then the likelihood that you'll end up earning a very nice compensation package overall is quite high. And on top of that, we would emphasize incentives are not simply the cash we pay you, but it's also the way we treat you. People respond not only to how much money you throw at them, but to how you treat them. The better we treat you, the less money we have to throw at you to keep you showing up to work every day, and more importantly, while you're at work, working hard. If we treat you well, we have lots of evidence that people show up and work really hard. If we simply think by throwing money at them, they're going to show up and work hard, we find they do show up, but the working hard part tends to not show up so much. Right? They don't stay loyal, they're not diligent, they're not hardworking, etc.
The concern is that most companies, we think, would be better off without having any such incentives at all, and that if they do feel that they need to provide bonuses, they're probably better off providing just general profit sharing. Basically, it all comes down to this: are you a learning-based organization or not? And if you are paying people on the basis of outcomes for indicators, people aren't interested in learning, they're interested in reaching the targets. And then we'll do whatever they need to do, whether it's value enhancing or value destroying, to make sure that they reach those targets, and then the company's going to die.
Well, on that thought, I'll say thank you very much,
Sure,
very
thank you.
much. S. David Young and Kevin Kaiser, good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.